Jane Dunnewold is the author of Complex Cloth, as well as a number of other titles. She is currently writing Art Cloth, A Guide to Layered Printing, which will be introduced to the UK at the 2010 festival. Jane teaches and exhibits widely and was recently named the Vice President of Outreach for the International Surface Design Association.
The series that I'm exhibiting here is called Intimate Conversations. Originally I had something else in mind, but when I started to think about the booth size, I realized that I wanted to be able to work within the limitations, which is actually a creative way to work sometimes. So I felt that because I was introducing a book that had to do with surface design patterning techniques, that it might be fun to go back to my roots, which were the dyeing, the discharging, and the printing with the textile paints. So I started by preparing some backgrounds, and at the same time I was looking at buying some clothing from, I think you call here a charity shop. I bought some clothing there and started to do the dyeing of the clothing and realized that the clothing was really beautiful in combination with the backgrounds that I had. So the series unfolded in that way. The backgrounds were created, and then I realized I could introduce the clothing into the pieces directly onto the surface, and when I did that, it referenced a human being in a way that was really appealing. So I'd like to talk specifically about this piece. This piece is called Tacit Agreement. And you can see the background patterning here. It's a combination of flower paste resist, which is the black crackle that you can see. The original dyed fabric is a cotton. All of the pieces that I make begin as white fabric, and so on this particular piece I dyed the background yellow, and then I started to introduce some screen printing using thermofaxes. And so you'll see a number of different ways of using the tool, one of which is to use it with textile paint. Another way to use the screen was to actually introduce the dévoré process, which is a burnout process, and you can see some of that represented here. I'm experimenting with some relatively new techniques, and so on the far left corner of this piece, you'll see this curlicue pattern introduced again in black, and that's actually sand. I print an adhesive and then I pour the sand over the adhesive, and later when it dries I shake it off, and it creates a textured surface that I find really pleasing. The clothing that was introduced here is actually a shirt that has a pattern woven into it, and the pattern woven into it actually supported the beautiful orange-yellow color that it dyed. And then I have been saving a very small piece of an end of a table runner, and there's a bird embroidered here by hand on the table runner. When I saw that bird and I put it in the juxtaposition with the human reference, I realized we needed a cage. And so I drew the cage and turned it into a small screen and printed it. And so all of the pieces in the series have this reference to the human being, and that's what the clothing represents. And then in addition to that, there's usually some sort of an interaction occurring. So this piece is called Tacit Agreement because, of course, when we have a bird in a cage, we have a certain kind of agreement that we're driving. Now let's talk about this particular piece. This is called Grandmother's House. And the basic strategy for the series is the same. So you'll actually see a very similar, exactly the same pattern, the curlicue pattern, but in this case it's been used with a paper lamination process. Paper lamination is a process that I actually helped pioneer, and on this particular piece the paper that I used is newsprint. As this piece developed, I realized that the beautiful piece of old embroidery was a perfect fit on the background, and so you'll see that piece of lace. And the lace, the music, and the raised sand pattern all reminded me of the kinds of things that I used to see when I went to my grandmother's house as a little girl. So in this particular piece, the clothing is a very small little rayon, I think it's a sweater, and I think, let's see, that's a jumper here, I think. And that is a very small corner, and to me that's the little girl looking into her grandmother's house and appreciating the music and the beauty and all of the wonderful atmospheres that are created when we go to visit our grandparents in that loving environment. The idea of the intimate conversation, which is really the inspiration behind all of these pieces, has to do with the way I develop my own work. First I do some writing. Then I look at the images and I decide what kinds of elements I need. I really wanted to work with a smaller format here. Most of my work, recent work, has been quite large and sometimes in a vertical orientation. So these pieces are quite different because they were deliberately created not only to fit within this smaller space, which is intimate in and of itself, but also to incorporate patterns that are relatively small and intimate. And I think all of that is driven by my desire to have a sense of a human being without the actual human being in the piece. And so when you see the clothing and it represents the human being, it's on a human scale because it is literally cut-ups of clothing. And so I think having this long, let's see, I think this is a portrait, or let's see, a landscape, I think is what we would call this format. Having the human reference because of the scale of the clothing also supports the scale of the orientation. The next piece I'd like to talk about is a piece called Love Affair. This seems to have been a particular favorite at the festival. And it's in that same series, so we're still in the idea of the intimate conversation. In this particular piece, I have some of the reference to the imagery that was in the other pieces that I shared, but there are some additions. And so the repurposed clothing that I've used here represent quite obviously a female half and a male half. And they're very close together, as young people are when they're in love. And in addition to that, I've tried to introduce some references to love, and so we have some silk screening printing in gold leaf here, the X's and the O's, which of course are the hugs and the kisses. And then on the other end of the piece, here on the male side, where sometimes it's not quite so much of a flourish and not so obvious as the gold leaf is, we have the hugs and kisses, but this time they're in black sand. That's the sand printing again. And then I like to add elements that people have to walk up and really investigate in order to appreciate. And so on this particular piece, when you get really close to it, you can see a series of little hatch marks. And that's, sometimes we use those to count down to a special holiday. But in this case, I think these two lovers are counting down the number of days or adding to the days that they've been together and been in love. So it's a sentimental piece, and perhaps that's why it was one of the favorites here. I'm Jane Dunnewold, and I'm here at the Festival of Quilts in Birmingham, England in 2010.